Is making homemade pasta really worth it? I am Amy from A Red Spatula, and I am here to present the facts and let you decide. I am going to show you how to make homemade pasta with my tried and true techniques, but I'm also going to be sharing some tips and tricks that I learned at a pasta making class on a recent trip to Italy. But I also want to hear from you. Don't forget to drop your comments or questions in the comment section below. And of course, if you tried the recipe, I would love to hear of your successes. And of course, don't forget to subscribe. You don't want to miss any of the new videos that are coming out. Okay, so I use two different flours in mine, and I learned this from my class. One is semolina flour, which comes from Durham wheat. And then the second is this 00 flour. I've always used all-purpose, but in the Italian pasta making class that I took, they used this 00 flour, which is a very fine grind of flour. I loved it. The pasta was like melt in your mouth, so I highly recommend it. Now you are going to pile these onto your work surface along with the salt, mix them together, and then you're going to form a well. They said to make it look like the Colosseum. That's so Italian, right? And then once you have the sides of this area formed, we're going to drop in our eggs. And then when the eggs are in, now this is another thing that I learned. I've always just mixed them kind of gently and then started mixing in the flour. In this class, they had us really kind of go to town on these eggs and make sure that they're mixed together really well. And then what you're going to do is you're going to start bringing in the flour from the sides. And another thing I learned is once you start bringing the flour, mix it in the middle before you add in more. Now eventually, of course, you're going to get to the point where it looks kind of like this, where almost all the flour from the edges has been mixed in. It looks really bad at this point, obviously, and you're probably wondering whether or not it's going to turn out. And at this, when you get here, you're going to trade out your fork, of course, and we're going to start kneading it by hand. You can try and do this in a mixer, but I think the dough is just too stiff for a hand mixer. And then what I do is I kind of squeeze the dough together. It's this mix of dough that's a little bit too wet, but also a little bit dry. So you're just trying to incorporate all of that flour on the bottom. And then when you get here, you're going to be able to feel and kind of decide whether or not you need more flour or you need more water. My eggs obviously were not as big. You can see how dry it is. So I added a little bit of water to mine, and that's exactly what you should do. I added in about another tablespoon. What you want the dough to feel like is just barely sticky, like just barely sticky. You don't want it to be too dry, and you can feel if it's dry or not when you're kneading it. So now it's just muscle work. We're going to work this and work this and work this and knead it back and forth. If you need to, sprinkle your surface with just a tiny bit of flour and then continue to knead it. When you get to this point where I would say you're about halfway through your kneading process, we're going to cover the dough and we're going to let it rest for just 5 to 10 minutes. You can see it's getting pretty close. So I just cover it up for a little bit, walk away, come back, and the dough is going to be relaxed and a lot easier to knead, and it's going to knead very quickly. The dough is starting to smooth out. You want it to look like this when it's finished. You want it to be very smooth. And then the dough gets covered, and I usually let it sit for half an hour to an hour. You wrap it in saran wrap. When you're ready to start forming it, just take that saran wrap off. The dough is going to feel a little bit sticky. You can add more flour as you work the dough, or not as you work the dough, as we roll out the dough, as needed, of course. And I added a little bit every time that I rolled it. Now I have a Bosch mixer, and that is what I use, and I have the pasta attachment for it. That's what I use to roll out my dough. You can also do this with a hand crank pasta maker. I have that as well, and I use it pretty often. Or if you have a KitchenAid one, you can use that as well. Now my Bosch, it goes from 7 down to 0. So here I'm 7 and then 6. I'm going to do the 5, and then what we're going to do is we're going to do a tri-fold of the dough. This is going to strengthen your dough, and it makes it so much easier to roll the dough out when you do this. And then we're going to start running it back through and continue the process. And I run mine all the way down to 2 or 1 on the Bosch mixer pasta attachment. Sorry, that was a mouthful. And then once the dough is rolled, of course, you can choose whatever you want to do with this. My son wanted some fettuccine pasta, so that was what I made with this. So once it's rolled out to a 2 or a 1, depending on how thick you want it, And then I add my fettuccine attachment. I have a fettuccine attachment on my, for my pasta attachment as well. I'm just going to run it through that. It's all very simple. In our class, we did fettuccine and we did ravioli. Now, one thing I will say is I like to cut my pasta down a little bit before I do the fettuccine, otherwise it would be very long. Of course, I cut these down to, I don't know, about 10 to 12 inches. I'm not really worried about perfection here. And I also make sure that I'm sprinkling these with a little bit more semolina flour, and that's just so that it doesn't stick when it goes through the fettuccine attachment. Once it's attached, I just go ahead and roll it through, and you can see this rolls through so quickly. So when we're asking the question, is it worth it? I would say yes, honestly. I think pasta is a little time consuming, but well worth it. Now, if you have a pasta dryer, go ahead and put it out on that. If not, when you're getting ready to cook it, which we were cooking ours right after we formed it, just sprinkle it with a little more flour. Bring your water to a boil, of course, just like we always do with pasta. Salt it very heavily. They say that it should be like the Mediterranean Sea. And then we're going to add in our pasta. Make sure it's a full rolling boil when you add your pasta in, and kind of break it up just a little bit. Mine sat for a little bit because we were getting ready to film, and it just took a little while to get it set up. So it's a little bit crinkly, a tiny bit stuck together. And then once it's in there, you can see I'm not mixing it. I'm just kind of picking it apart with a fork just a little bit. Now, fresh pasta cooks very, very quickly. It's going to take about 2 minutes. So tell me, what do you think? Too much work, or is it totally worth it? For me, the answer is always, it's worth it.